Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me here. This is a strange one for me. I have a sort of weird split life between art and science. The science I could talk about in my sleep. I have never talked about the art in this way before. So I'll give a little bit of background to my career into both science and art, and then go through a little bit about the technical side of etching, and then through some of my work, and finish up with a little bit maybe more philosophical about what it is that I'm trying to achieve with the art. So hopefully, yay. So as I said, I've got a weird double life in art and science. Mostly it's still science. I'm employed here full-time as a professor in the School of Earth and Environment, where I work on problems in ocean atmosphere interaction, hence the being stuck out at sea over Christmas in really grotty weather, and polar, in particular Arctic climate. So I've spent a lot of time, something like well over a year, doing fieldwork in the Arctic, and something like 18, 19 months total at sea in one capacity or another. So on the left here, this is me working in the Arctic, trying to get a recalcitrant bit of equipment to work. And on the left, me going to sea again. This is actually on a week-long sailing and landscape drawing residency that I did as a break last summer. What I do is, when I'm going way back when I was a teenager, between the ages of about 13 and 15, 16, if you'd asked me what I wanted to do, I would have said art, or at that point, illustration mostly. My interests were very much driven by book illustration primarily. And then I sort of A-levels, and then I chickened out and went and did physics, because that seemed like a rather safer option for getting employed. Stayed on to do a PhD in atmospheric physics. This is in Manchester. Went to work at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in San Diego. Spent 8 years there doing marine boundary layer meteorology, and then came back to Leeds in 2002, and have been here ever since. For most of that time, I have also continued drawing, painting, artwork in some capacity, initially doing odd bits of illustration and graphics. More recently, drifting into fine art and etchings. And there was a point, as was mentioned, where I was very busy with academic work. As soon as you've got sort of faculty position, the pressure ramps up. You need to do a lot of teaching and get grants in and do research, get papers published. And I didn't do much art for about 10 years. I did a little bit, but I had sort of lost focus, didn't really know what I was wanting to do. And then I discovered etching, where a friend of mine who had a background in printmaking pushed me into it and going like, you'd like etching, you should give it a try. So I eventually I caved in, bought a small secondhand etching press and started playing around with it, with a stack of teach yourself etching books, and a lot of trial and error, mostly error. It has to be said. In retrospect, I should have gone and done a course somewhere, and I could have shortcut about 3 years of disastrous etchings, but I was sort of stubborn and wanted to do it myself. So I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about the techniques of etching. Most people would think of an etching as looking something like this. This is James McNeill Whistler, one of his famous etchings of Venice, working in the 19th century. And this is sort of classic etching where, for anyone who doesn't know, does anybody know how etchings are made? One. two, maybe a bit, yeah, a little bit. So very few people do. Even most artists don't know the details of it. So classically, for something like this, you would have a metal plate, traditionally copper, which is a relatively soft metal, so easy to etch. It is coated with a wax ground that will resist the acid, and then the drawing is made with a fine needle and just scratching away the wax ground. You're not making any mark in the metal plate itself, just removing the wax ground and drawing into it. That's then put into acid. That can be immersed in a bath of acid, or Whistler often painted the acid on with a feather, so he could control how long different parts of the drawing got etched for. The longer it's etched, the deeper the line of the exposed metal. The deeper it goes, the more ink it will hold ultimately, and the darker and thicker the line you will get. So that is a relatively simple process and isn't what I am doing. I am using what is known as aquatint, which allows you to get these sort of subtle tonal effects, effectively a means of getting a half tone. And aquatint is a somewhat mercurial process at best. It is subject to a lot of semi-random factors that are not entirely under the artist's control, and you have to respond to that a little bit. And there's a quote that I really like, I've forgotten who it's from, which said that printmaking, in particular etching, is fun because it takes a really simple process like drawing and makes it as complicated and error-prone as possible. And you have to live with that. So I'm going to go through a little bit about how the aquatints are made, because a lot of people look at these and just have no idea. I had no idea when I started about. So there's a lot of tonal variation here. We can go from deep saturated blacks to very, very fine, subtle gradations of tone up to a hard white. And the process is, in essence, relatively simple. We have our copper plate, and it is coated with aquatint resin, which is a dust. It's effectively pine resin, same stuff that you would stick on violin bows. And it's crushed to make a very, very fine powder. Anyone who remembers their school science lessons mucking around with lycopodium powder, or now maybe very fine talcum powder, it's that sort of really, really fine. It will, any draft, it's going to drift around, so you have to be quite careful applying it. And that is then heated from the bottom side of the plate, and the resin melts, and surface tension will pull it up into little beads, and those beads fuse to the plate. So they are now firmly attached, effectively glued to the surface of the plate. And what we're aiming for is a 50% coverage of those beads of resin and 50% exposed bare plate. And then if we apply some acid, not usually with a bucket, but a little more gently, and the plate gets eaten away between those beads of resin. And again, the longer you bite for, expose it to the acid, the deeper they will be, and the darker the tone that you get. So to get a solid black on copper with the materials, I use etch with, you do use different acids. I use ferric chloride, which is fairly innocuous. It doesn't produce any fumes, noxious fumes as you etch, so it's safe to use at home. It's not poisonous. It won't eat away at your flesh if you spill it on yourself. It will stain anything it touches forever. Don't wear clothes you care about while doing this. It's what they use in the electronics industry for etching circuit boards, which is where I first used it. To get with that a deep black etch, it takes somewhere around 10 to 15 minutes in the acid to get that. So you can control that a huge range of tones by biting from maybe 10 seconds and slowly longer and longer, and you can get this full range of tones. So before printing, the aquatint resin is dissolved off. It dissolves in methylated spirits, so it's easy to clean off. And then we ink the plate with a stiff oil-based ink, and then it is wiped clean from the surface, so the ink is just retained in the etched marks on the plate's surface, not on the very top of the plate. We'll come back to that. So that is what you would get just to do a bare plate, and you could get a plate that would print a solid tone if you just immersed it in acid, or you could draw directly on it with a brush with acid and get, as we'll see, something different. But if you want an image, something that you can recognize, we need to mask the plate in some way. So we can do that in two ways. We can paint on or apply anything that will resist the acid. So anything waxy or oily, you can use oil pastels, stop out varnish, the wax ground, the hard ground that you might use to do a traditional line drawing etching. And that will make negative marks, the bits that won't etch. If you want to make a positive mark, the bit that will etch, it's a little more convoluted, and we use what's called a sugar lift. So this is painted on, that image is drawn on with a saturated sugar solution. There are various recipes for this. Does anyone know the artist Norman Ackroyd? Good, yes. I tried following his recipes. So I first discovered his work in one of the books about how to make etchings, and there was a recipe for his sugar lift solution, which I duly followed and tried out, and it failed completely. It would either sort of dry and crystallize up, or it would never dry at all. So clearly there's subtleties to mixing that recipe. What I actually use now, which is fantastic, is neat camp coffee, which is perfect. So this, it will become evident what it is shortly. This is just drawn on with a fine brush with the sugar lift solution. That is then allowed to dry. It will dry to a tacky finish. It won't be completely dry, but it will not be easily moved around. And then we paint over it a stop out varnish or hard ground. So I use a liquid ground, so just a soft watercolor brush about 1 to 2 inches wide. Paint over the surface, leave that to dry. Then put that all into hot water. It needs to be hot. Basically, it needs to be just too hot to be able to keep your hand in it. Is about right. And the sugar then softens and melts in the hot water and can be easily removed, leaving the masked ground around the area, masking out the bits that you don't want to etch, and the drawing that you've done is now exposed. We then apply, this is me applying the aquatint resin and melting it on. Traditionally, the aquatint would be applied in an aquatint box. So I'll stop that and come back to it in a moment. So you have a big box which has got a paddle in the bottom. You put a cup full of aquatint resin on there, turn the paddle round, it fills the big box with a cloud of resin, and then you lock the paddle, put your plate in, and go and have a cup of tea. And when your cup of tea is finished, all the resin has drifted out and settled on the plate. These are quite large, take up a lot of space. I don't have room for one. They're also expensive. About £1,000 if you buy one from an art suppliers. What I was doing here is hand dusting it on. So I've got a jam jar of the resin with some fine cloth over it and just bang on the top and slowly coat the plate. And then this is applying the acid with a brush which will then allow me very fine control over how long different parts of the plate are etched, and allows these sort of soft watercolor-like marks to be made. This is called spit biting, which is because on its own, the acid will tend to bead up if you've got a large area of the aquatint fused to the plate, it's pretty much water resistant, and the acid, when it goes on, will form beads and break up, so you don't get a uniform finish, and you've got to keep moving it around, and it's a bit of a mess. It can be used like that to interesting effect, but if you want a more uniform tone, and particularly hard edges at the edge of the mask, you need to break the surface tension. And traditionally, that was done by spitting in the acid, which acted as a surface tension breaker. Anyone who's been diving or swimming with goggles, it's often you spit in the goggles and smooth it, and that stops it misting up, because it acts as a surface tension breaker and stops beads of water condensing out on the surface of the goggles. So this has been, I've washed over this. I haven't spit in it. I use a very weak soap solution. So a small jar of water with like one small squeeze of liquid soap into it. So that breaks the surface tension, and then I can wash the acid on. And this is what prints when I had finished that. So this is a little bit of mountainside somewhere, and washing the acid on slowly allows me to get darker tones down here, coming up to bits where it bleeds out completely into the cloud that's partly covering the mountainside. So you can get this very soft gradation of tone. And that is the first state of this print. So the images are not drawn all at once. They're built up slowly in many, many layers of separate bytes. Typically, I would probably have something like 20 to 30 layers of separate bytes that are done one by one. If you're being really picky and careful, you might print a proof from that like this at every byte, so you can see how the image is progressing and how you want to respond to that. Is it dark enough? Is it too dark? I tend to print a proof probably every 2 or 3 bytes, trying to work in areas that don't depend upon each other. So if I can do work on one area of the print and then separately clean off everything, then work on another area of the print. In order to do that, I don't need to know what the outcome of the first bit was. Then I'll do as many layers like that as I can, just to keep things moving. And partly because every time you print, you wear the plate very slightly. It's quite soft metal. It goes under very high pressure when you're printing. At the end, with the final image, I can probably get something like 20, 30, maybe 40 or 50 prints. On a run of 50, by the end of it, they will be getting weaker because we're slowly wearing down the plate a little bit. And so I don't like to pull too many proofs in the development of an image in case I do too much wear of the plate and I start to damage what I'm working on. So this is another more complex image. To do this, this is all the first layer of sugar lift. There is hours and hours of working on it. And sometimes it's weird, you can do like hours, a whole afternoon of drawing on the sugar lift, getting stuff just as you need it, coat it, get it ready, and then it's bitten for 30 seconds per minute. So there's this really big disconnect between how long you spend on the drawing part of it and how long you spend on the actual etching of the plate. This is, so flipping through, that's the sugar lift on. This is after the sugar lift has been lifted off. So the dark brown on here is the stop out varnish that's been painted over, and then the sugar dissolved off, exposing the areas of the plate that will bite. That's a close-up of a section up around here after it's been bitten, so you can sort of see this rough texture of the bitten plate where it will hold onto the ink. And that's the image that results from it. So again, this is the first state of a complex image. And how you do this depends on the image, where you go. Here, I was really trying to establish this mountainside with all the deep shadows on it and get the structure of that. And then start to apply paler tones over it. You could try and work the other way, start with the palest tones, maybe do that whole mountain as a pale area to establish where it is and then work in detail. How you approach that is very much a matter of personal preference and experience and intuition. And I will maybe come back to some of the subtleties, the vagaries of the aquatint process there in a little bit. This is working on the plate a bit more, adding more details, further back bit of mountainside in the background. This is then the plate that is almost finished, and that's the image that results from it. This is not quite the final state, I think, but it's very close. And when you get to this point, is that where you look at it and you think, like, is it finished? Am I happy? What's wrong? And sometimes I put things aside for weeks and come back to it because I know it's not done, but I'm not sure quite what it is that it needs. And it gets more and more stressful, nervous doing this because you've had more and more time spent on it. It's getting closer and closer, and there is more and more chance that something you do in trying to finish it makes a complete mess of it. And I have had things that have had several weeks of work, and then I've done something that's just ruined it, and that's now scrap metal. Start again. So one of the subtleties here is that as you etch, be a temptation, say some of this paler tone in the mountainside, that's probably a minute and a half, 2 minutes etched in that. And it is tempting to think that if you wanted to get it a little bit darker, you could add another 30 seconds with another aquatint and it would make it a little bit darker, because that's how it would work if you were drawing in an ink wash or a watercolor, and it doesn't. And with the very pale tones, it sort of does. And as you get towards the mid-tones, because that aquatint is a random pattern on the surface, if you put another layer of random pattern over it and etch for another 5 minutes, say, on something that's already had 5 minutes etch, what you actually do is remove some of the etching that you've already done. So some of the peaks get etched down and some of the bits might get etched deeper. And you can put in an awful lot of work, etch it again, print it, and it made no difference at all. And if you want to go for something that needs to be a 6 or 7 minute etch, even if it's already had 5 minutes and you're putting over it, you need to do the full 6 or 7 minutes to actually get the tone that you want. Took me a while to figure that out. And it's somewhat still, because it's this random factor, and the speed of the etch depends a little bit on the temperature and how exactly dense did you get that aquatint resin. Is it a little bit denser or a little bit less dense than the first coat? Sometimes I think it depends what day of the month it is. It is a lot of random factors and quite a bit of intuition in inspecting it and saying, does it look right? And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, which is why it's fun. So having got the plate, then we ink it with stiff oil-based ink. I apply that with offcuts from mountboard, which have had like window mounts, so they've got a hard chamfered edge to them. Then it's wiped with some scrim. This is sort of coarse, slightly starched cloth. Initially, the first pass over it, I'm pushing the ink down into the plate to try and make sure that it's pushed right down into all the etched lines. And then it's gently wiped off. And over time, the image is revealed, and we start to wipe with, initially with still a sort of dirty, inky cloth, slowly with a cleaner one, and then for highlights, we'll give a little bit of extra burnishing, and eventually tissue paper to polish up the real highlights to get all the ink off that surface. Otherwise, it's very easy, particularly with larger areas of unbitten plate, to leave quite a film of ink on it, which prints as what's known as the plate tone. So that is then put on the bed of the press. So this is a cylinder press. I use sheet of paper with registration sheet that shows where the plate should go, where the printing paper should go, so I get the print in the same portion of the paper every time. Between that and the plate is put a tissue paper that stops any ink on the back of the plate, marking the registration paper, which might then transfer to the print. New sheet of tissue paper with every print. Then that's the paper going on. This is quite thick paper, and it's soaked first, so it softens, and then blotted dry. Needs to be damp, but not so damp that it will squeeze water out when it goes through the press, which water and oil don't mix, so that would cause problems on the print. And then it's wound through under really high pressure. It's quite hard work, at least with larger plates. There's a tissue paper between the damp paper and the blankets on the press, which transfer the pressure through and allow it to push the paper into the etched lines. That's to stop the blankets picking up the size from the paper and getting mucky. And then that's the print, final print. And then that's repeat for however many prints you want in addition. And depending upon the size of the plate and how difficult it is to wipe. So some plates seem to be really easy, it doesn't take much and you get a good image, particularly ones that are mostly darker tones. Ones that have a lot of complex and strong contrasts tend to be trickier. You need to be a bit more careful with the wipe. That can take quite a bit of time. So typically I can get a print every something like between 10 minutes for a simple one and 20 to 30 minutes for a complex one. So that's a full day's work. I can maybe get 10 to 20 prints done. So I'm now going to go through an example of prints, and these are the ones that actually got me the invitation to come and speak to you. This is from an exhibition at the Zillar Bell Gallery in Thirsk, who are an excellent gallery for printmakers. They have a passion for it and strongly promote print. And so I had an exhibition there a couple of years ago, and it was titled South, because most of the images came from the Southern Ocean, which is where the crossover with my science that I spent 2011, 2012, 2013, I did research cruises in the Southern Ocean down here, somewhere between South Atlantic, somewhere between the southern tip of Chile and the Antarctic Peninsula here, and visiting particularly Cygney Island and South Georgia. The science I was doing was open ocean, but the ship was the British Antarctic Survey's James Clark Ross. There was also doing support for the bases on Cygney and South Georgia. So we got to go in, and when we went in these places, of course, we're not working, so I had time to sketch a little bit and mostly take thousands of photographs. And then initially I knew I wanted to make etchings of this stuff, but I'd only just started playing around with aquatint, and I knew at the time I didn't have the technical skills to do justice to the images that I wanted to make. And it took a few years to get me up, so I was happy that I could produce something that I would show somebody else. And then COVID hit, and suddenly I was spending a lot more time at home. I was not spending 2 hours a day commuting, so I had a much shorter day. And I set into making a set of etchings based on mostly photographs from down south. So this is one of the first ones, both in visits to the islands. This is on Bird Island, and one of the very first etchings I made, which I thought sort of worked. And I was beginning to get a handle on how to get these soft tones and the sort of detail that I was after. It's not one of my best now, looking back at it, but it was a sort of landmark, somewhere where I felt I'd made a real jump in what I was doing technically. And this is the Moraine Fields. This is on South Georgia in Cumberland East Bay, which is a field where the British Antarctic Survey's base is at King Edward Point, and about a mile along the coast from there is Grytviken, which is an old whaling station, which is where Shackleton is buried. And this is a view up one of the fields close to that area. So Grytviken is off the way around to the right somewhere on here. This is the record. Everybody, if you want to move around so you can see better, please do. The wreck of the Lynn. So this is I think it's a Korean fishing vessel that ran aground on some shoals. This is just across the bay from the King Edward Point base, while seeking shelter from a storm in around 2008, 9, 10, something like not many years before I visited. And I visited twice, a couple of years apart, and it was visibly degrading and falling apart between those visits. And this Cumberland East Bay iceberg that was wedged, it's actually grounded, so that stayed there for many months. I can't remember which way round it was, but I was there on the James Clark Ross, and some months later my wife was down there for 3 weeks working on another project, and the same iceberg was still wedged in the same place. And again, this was a relatively early etching, and one again that seemed a leap forwards in understanding what I was doing and making progress, and it's also been quite a popular one. There is just one left from the edition of this now. A little close-up of it. Then this is on Signy Island, Waterpipe Beach. So this is again British Antarctic Survey have a base there that is mostly a biology research station, summer only these days, and we would call in to help close the base down for the winter and take everybody off, take all the rubbish out, and we got a few hours as well to just sort of wander around and have a look, and then a guided walk over the glacier and down to see a penguin colony, which was a real treat. This is also Signy Island, is actually sort of around to the right of this view, is this one being a little more zoomed in. And this is the image that you saw right at the start that I was working on, just the mountains at the top, which is a look at the carving front of the Nordenskjold glacier at the end of the field there, which features in several etchings. This is Grytviken itself. It's the old derelict whaling station, now a historical site that's being preserved as well as they can. And on this visit, snow-covered hillside behind it. And Shackleton's grave is somewhere around here, somewhere. And King Edward Point, the Bass base, is off to over there somewhere. And in between the two, at the time there are lots of fur seals, which look quite cute. They're about the size of a Labrador, and they are vicious little buggers. They will quite happily chase you and bark at you, hunt you almost. And you really, really don't want to get bitten by them. The first aid treatment for that, the first initial treatment, is to scrub the wound out with a toothbrush and Dettol. and then you are on antibiotics for months afterwards. They're really nasty. Close up. So this is one where it's quite a careful wipe needed, trying to burnish the hard white of the snow-covered roofs against the solid black of the building walls. And this is about 12 inches square, which is about the largest that I can print with the press that I've got. So it's got a 13-inch wide bed. So I can go longer, but I'm limited to how wide I can go. This is another mountain, again, the Northern Skjold Glacier at the end. Another one that's about 12 inches. This is the final version of Mount Paget, which, again, we saw some in-progress shots of earlier. A little close-up detail here. And Henriksen Buttress, which is, again, just across the way from the Bass base. And these ones form a little sequence that are all in the same format, mountains around the same bay that, again, have been quite popular ones. Again, a little closer up on that. If anyone has questions while I'm going on, just shout out.
Presumably the paper you use is pretty important as well.
It is, yes. It needs to be quite soft. So I use, it's 300 grams per square metre. Somerset satin is my usual paper from St Cuthbert's Mill. So it's a paper that's intended for printmaking. It's made specifically for intaglio prints, so etchings or dry points or copper engravings. So it is very lightly sized. So most paper, like heavy watercolor paper, is quite heavily sized usually. So the water doesn't just sort of soak into it, it sits a little more on the surface. The printmaking papers for etching tend to be very lightly sized and internally sized, so they don't have a coating on the surface. So they soften very nicely, and they get pressed into the plate. So the ink is actually picked up from in the etched grooves by pushing the paper into the etched lines or texture. And particularly on a line etching, you can often, if you let it dry and stroke it, you can feel that the black lines stick up and leave a texture.
So the fuzziness, as it were, of the print, that is nothing to do with the paper.
No, different papers will give slightly different qualities. So if you get a cheaper paper, a lot of people maybe use what's known as bread and butter paper for proofing, where you don't want to use your really expensive paper because you might get dozens of proofs that you're basically just ending up in the bin. But there is a noticeable difference if you just print on a cheap paper and then on a really good printmaking paper. There is a clearly improved quality to the print. The fuzziness here is a sort of deliberate attempt to try and get that sort of looking through a misty low cloud into the hills beyond. This one was a bit of an experiment in technique. So all the drawing in here is done by applying either stop out or the sugar lift with a sponge. So you get a little texture rather than trying to draw very fine detail. So you're getting some random patterns in there. These two are among the only 3 etchings I've made which are not from my own photographs or drawings in the field, and that's all those 3 are from commissioned pieces. These 2 were from a colleague of mine at the National Oceanography Centre who commissioned them for his 50th birthday present for himself. And are from his photographs taken going through the Lemaire Channel in Antarctica, somewhere I have never been and am deeply envious of. And this is the other one that is not is a commission where I have not been. It's Port Lockroy, which is now just a historical site, but which was one of the first British outposts in Antarctica, the first research station there. So I'll finish up talking a little bit more about not the technical side of the process, but the more what I'm thinking, what I'm trying to get at in terms of the art of it, perhaps. So all the south etchings were made from photographic reference. I had made a few drawings while I was down there, but mostly we were working from on the ship. The ship's moving around most of the time, so the view keeps moving off sideways, which is frustrating when you're trying to draw it. So I was mostly working from photographs, but I'm not just looking at a photograph and trying to reproduce that. It's very easy to fall into the trap of trying to reproduce every detail of the photograph, in which case, why not just print the photograph? There are techniques, you make photo etchings, photogravure processes, which would do a much better job. I'm trying to abstract it a little bit and see or represent something about what I find interesting in the view, how I feel about it. So this image, the plate is shown here. This is on Sydney Island, and I've focused in on this little rock outcrop here in this area, zoomed in here. I liked the shape of this. The line of first hills here and then another hill back there seemed to make a nice sort of reasonably, not quite symmetric, but almost. What I'm often looking for, trying to capture, is something which is either got some sort of symmetry to it in the composition, or is some sort of more broken symmetry, that there is, you can see there is something almost symmetrical there, but it's broken in some way. All of these, although they start from photographic reference, get filtered through sketches, which I try and treat as I would if I was sketching out in the field. So I've got a photograph displayed on the laptop, and I just sit there with a sketchbook on my lap and some ink and draw away. So this is the sketch from this, very rough at this stage, and it's trying to establish a little more of just ideas of the composition. That this feature wants to be quite strong. This is more detailed line of hills, and this back one I'm just sort of pushing right back and losing all the detail in it. And right at the top, there's three little sketches where I'm just trying to find the balance in the composition. How high do I want to set the horizon line? Where do I want to focus? Trying to see what works best. And then that's the final etching. And this is one of the cases I said that sometimes I just make a mess of it. Sometimes that's technically, and sometimes it is more artistically, that it's just not working. And this one is actually the third attempt at this view in different formats. So one of them was much wider view, more panoramic. One of them was larger. This is actually quite small. It's 10 by 12 centimeters, so quite really small plate. And this finally seemed to work. Sometimes the images, when I'm looking at it, I've usually got an idea of what scale it wants to be. Sometimes it could work really small or really large, and maybe something middling is like, not so sure. In theory, it shouldn't matter, but somehow it does. This then is that Port Lockroy. In this case, this is just the inked plate just before printing it. And in some cases, the plates work beautifully on their own. And this one actually, when it works like that, I often, when I finish printing the edition, I ink it a final time, wipe it down so it's ready to print, and then just let it dry, and then spray a clear lacquer over it. So it's just like what you put as a clear lacquer on car paintwork, which seals it and stops the plate corroding. And then it looks great in its own right. In this case, somebody actually offered to buy it, and along with a copy of the etching. And for anyone who's interested, I have a couple of plates that I brought along so you can see what they actually look like. And this one is actually this plate with its The prints, of course, are the mirror image of what you draw on the plate. So if you're drawing a real place, you have to remember to flip it over. So that is sometimes done if I'm working from photographic reference or even from sketches. I'll photograph them sometimes and then just flip the image and display it on a laptop because it is convenient. Means I can zoom in on areas if I need to take a closer look at something. Or sometimes I get a sketchbook and then just prop it up in front of a mirror and I'm drawing from the mirrored image. On one occasion, I got really enthusiastic and just went straight in from the sketch. And only when I printed the proof did I go, that's the wrong way around. Start again. And that's, in this case, this is the original sketch for this one. Another unique one, this is not actually any actual location. It's a sort of imagined view based on some sketches made around the lakes at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, which was a nice misty morning that they looked really nice. But I only grabbed very quick sketches and then reimagined it a little bit. And this is the way of working that I prefer, if I can, is to work directly from sketches made in the field. So this is looking up Loch Sligachen towards Sligachen Bridge on Skye last summer, and walking along the coastal path here. And this is actually done in the rain. So it was very, very quickly done, maybe 5 minutes, but is enough for me to get an atmospheric view. It captures what I wanted to in looking down the loch and the sort of cloud-shrouded, rain-drenched bits of the Coolins, a common feature of them, and to be able to get the etching out. So I have a copy of this etching with me, so you can have a look at the final thing, along with the sketch. That sketchbook is here as well. So this is again another one. This is looking across the bottom end of Skye at Knoydart, mountains of in Scotland, from the Isle of Rum, with a sketch and the final etching, and that's the plate that it is printed from. So Top Withens and near Howth. So I live in Howth, so this is a 45 minutes walk from home. Icebergs. This is very close to the North Pole. So again, on Arctic research expedition. This is, so I did make some sketches out there. Sat out on the sea ice with a sketchbook, trying to use water from a melt pond because I forgot to take a bottle of water out with me for the watercolors, which is slightly salty. And the humidity of the air is about 95%, which means that after the first wash, it never dries. So it was a very scrappy sketch. Another iceberg in the Kara Sea, again in the Arctic Ocean, from a few years before. Quick sketch. There's several. I was on an expedition this time last year from Svalbard into the Fram Strait. So these are a few views around Svalbard, along with the etching that is made from that ink sketch. This is another one, the etching, and that's the sketch made from it. So the ship was actually waiting for the pilot to come and take us back into port and was steaming up and down the fjord while I was on the bridge running backwards and forwards trying to get sketches made. And everything changes really quickly. So you'd be working on something, draw it, look up, and it's like, where did my mountain go? Because big clouds come over it. Or one's disappeared and what you thought was all this sort of just murky cloud is suddenly a whole new landscape. Which means you have to work quite fast. So that is it. I think I spotted a question coming up online. So what have we got? Yeah, so when working for photographs, do I favour black and white? Yes, I habitually work for the sketches in acrylic ink, which is a mix of black and sepia, that gives me a colour that is very close to the sepia inks that I use for print the etching. So it's when I'm sketching, I'm getting close to the sort of tones that I would get in the final etching. The fact it's acrylic ink is what is important because it will dry waterproof, and so I can sort of establish certain parts of the sketch and then wash over it without blurring everything and getting it to wash away, and which also helps when you're outside and it's raining, because this whole sketch doesn't just sort of wash away in the rain. What you don't want to do, which I have done, is then spill the whole bottle of it into your lap and over your sketchbook. Where first most important bit was washing all the ink off the sketch that I'd spent hours on. So that's just a bottle of water over it to wash that off. Then dumping some of my clothes in the river, the ones I cared about, to wash the ink out before it dries. And the rest of me was just stained, and still is. A pair of trousers that will not look good again. So other question, control of tonal variation is key. Yes, that is always what I'm working with, is tone rather than color. So I'm trying to get that, and it works well for a lot of the work that I've done. So all the Arctic and Antarctic work tend to be quite monochrome, more sort of shades of blues and browns, but I tried printing. There's another question here. Could I print with another color ink? Yes. And there are a few etchings like this where I have used blue inks. I've tried with a lot of the sort of ice-covered mountains scenes to print with blue inks, thinking, well, there's a lot of ice in there, that's blue, it ought to, and it never really worked. I've never been happy with them. The only time I've used the blues is where everything is ice, and there is no rocks in there that should be different. For some reason, it always works better in what is sepia. I add usually a little bit of red to it to warm it up a little bit, mostly because the various sepia inks that I've tried on their own, at least under some lights, have a rather unpleasant, slightly greenish tone, which I'm not fond of. Adding a little bit of red warms it up. Is also, because they're aquatints, trying to get these smooth tones. A bit of advice from Norman Ackroyd was using this particular carmine ink, which is very, very fine and sort of stretches, he says it stretches through a fine aquatint. So it helps get a good, nice, smooth tone. On its own, it seems to never dry. So anything that's got the pure ink on it, just weeks later, you'll find a piece of paper that's got some on, it'll still be wet.
Yeah, do you have any use for metal points for stippling or scratching? Does that apply in aquatint at all, or is it just
you can add, so that there's, I have done, so in the view of Gritviken, the buildings are initially drawn in with a hard ground and scratched in to give the outline of the buildings.
Traditional etching.
Yeah, so there's also occasionally I use a soft ground etching, which is it's a wax ground, but it's got a much higher content of very soft wax, so it doesn't dry fully. It stays very tacky, and then you put a sheet of thin paper over it, and draw onto that with whatever implements you want, and it removes some of the ground, and then you etch directly. There's no aquatint put on it, just etches directly, and it gives marks that look like soft pencil or charcoal.
Right.
So I occasionally use that as an early stage. Once you've got some aquatint on there, it's very difficult to apply either the soft ground or traditional line etching, because you've got a very rough surface. So you can't go sort of up and down this very coarse. It's like drawing on sandpaper. It doesn't work very well. A comment saying CP Snow was wrong about art and science being two cultures. Maybe. I do. The thought processes at times are quite similar. They are both sort of creative means of trying to solve a problem. Different problems, different methods, but the thought process is often quite similar. Right, thank you.
I think I'll only say that your talk was breathtaking, actually, and it's always fascinating to know how people work, and particularly impressed that you have the stamina to do this for so long.
Maybe say with the etching, it keeps me sane.
Yes.
An antidote to some of the insanities of university administration.
Well, we won't comment. This is the University of Leeds, and it is all about. Can you stop me?